Alright, this is our second chapter in Unit 1, Psychological Methods. And Section 1 is going to be on conducting research. The main idea, the steps that scientists follow in conducting research are fundamental to reaching reliable conclusions. Psychologists follow similar steps in conducting research. The steps of scientific research. Hopefully this is somewhat familiar to you from science classes. Psychologists tend to use the same general procedure when conducting research. The procedure consists of 5 steps: forming a research question, forming an hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, analyzing the results, and drawing conclusions. Our Section 2 will look at surveys, samples, and populations. One way to gather information is by asking people directly. Psychologists use this method to study people's attitudes and behaviors. The survey method. Psychologists usually use a survey to gather information about people by asking them directly. A survey is a series of questions people are asked to answer about a particular subject. Psychologists conduct surveys by asking people to fill out written questionnaires or by interviewing people orally. The findings of interviews and questionnaires may not be completely accurate, though. People might not be honest about their attitudes or behaviors. They may limit their responses for privacy reasons, or they may say what they think the interviewers want to hear. Populations and samples. To accurately predict an outcome, psychologists study a group that represents the target population. A target population is the whole group they want to study or describe. The target population includes only people who are relevant to the survey. Because it would be costly and difficult to interview or question every member of a target population, researchers are going to study a sample, and a sample is only part of the target population. Section 3, using observation for research. Psychologists use many different methods of observation in conducting their research. Then they use correlation to analyze and interpret their results. Methods of observation. Testing. Tests are given by psychologists to learn about human behavior. Case studies are an in-depth investigation over using a variety of resources and can possibly be over a period of time. Longitudinal is a study over a long period of time. Cross-sectional, using different groups of people who may differ in the variable of the study but have some similar characteristics. A naturalistic study is a study in a natural setting. And a laboratory observation is a study in a lab or a controlled environment. Once you have your observations, you need to analyze it. And one method psychologists use to analyze and interpret their observations is correlation. Correlation is a measure of how closely one thing is related to another. The stronger the correlation between two things, the more closely the two things are related. There's positive and negative correlation. Positive correlation occurs when an increase in one thing is accompanied by an increase in another. A negative correlation occurs when a decrease in one thing is accompanied by a decrease in another. But there are limits to correlation. Correlation describes relationships, but it doesn't reveal cause and effect. And just because two things are related does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. That's very important. Note how it is underlined. Just because two things are related does not necessarily mean that one causes the other. And Section 4 is experimental and ethical issues. The experimental method is used by researchers to answer questions about cause and effect. In addition, psychologists must consider the ethical issues involved in their experiments. The experimental method. Psychologists use the experimental method to answer questions about cause and effect. And within the experimental method, you would have independent and dependent variables. Experiments have variables which are factors that can vary or change. The independent variable is the factor that researchers manipulate. The dependent variable is the factor whose value depends on a change made to the independent variable. And on your test, there'll probably be some questions asking you to identify the independent versus the dependent variable. Experimental and control groups. Members of an experimental group receive the treatment, members of the control group do not. All other conditions are held constant or the same for both the experimental and the control group. A controlled experiment used both a control group and an experiment group. The placebo effect. A placebo is a substance or treatment that has no effect apart from a person's belief in its effect. Feeling better simply because we expect to feel better and for no other reason is an example of the placebo effect. Single and double-blind studies. Single-blind studies keeps participants unaware of the treatment they are receiving. Participants don't know if they are in the experimental group or the control group, and this is one way that researchers can avoid the influence of expectations. You can also have a double-blind study, and this is one in which both participants and the researchers are unaware of who receives the treatment. Double-blind studies help researchers avoid the influence of expectations and remain unbiased. Ethical issues. Ethics are standards for proper and responsible behavior. The American Psychological Association, or the APA, has established specific ethical guidelines that psychologists are required to follow. Research with people. Ethical standards limit the type of research psychologists may conduct with people. A leading ethical principle is that the study participants must not be harmed. Confidentiality. Psychologists treat the records of research participants and clients as confidential. Only in certain cases may psychologists disregard confidentiality. Informed consent. The APA generally requires that people who volunteer to participate in research studies provide informed consent. Informed consent means that the people agree or consent to participate in a research study only after they receive a general overview of the study and have been given the choice of whether or not to participate. Deception. Some psychological experiments, however, cannot be run without deceiving people. New drug experiments and other blind studies cannot be conducted without keeping participants unaware of treatment or the nature of the study. Psychologists follow APA guidelines when they must use deception. And finally, research with animals, which is sometimes a very hot-button topic. Most psychological studies that use animals do not harm the animals. Sometimes psychologists and other scientists conduct research that may be harmful to animals. Such studies often use animals because they cannot be carried out with people for ethical reasons. Psychologists use animals only when there is no alternative and when they believe the benefit outweighs the harm. Only a small number of psychological studies involve animals. Many people, however, believe that it is no more ethical to harm animals than it is to harm people. The APA has rules of ethics for how animals used in research should be treated. And that is it for Chapter 2. Your unit test will be a take-home test that you can use your notes on. So make sure that your notes are complete with the note column done and the cues column. Last week I handed out your essential questions for Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So make sure you go ahead and complete those essential questions for Chapter 2. And that is it.